Conferencia magistral. Micky Minhas es vicepresidente senior de Marconi Group desde marzo de 2020, una firma de licencias de propiedad intelectual y capital de riesgo con sede en Dallas, Texas. Como parte del equipo de gestión, apoya la visión de transformar los fundamentos de las licencias de propiedad intelectual, proporcionando mejores formas de compartir tecnología patentada. Minhas fue director de patentes de Microsoft, administrando el grupo de patentes desde 2012 hasta 2020, donde era responsable de administrar los activos de propiedad intelectual en todo el mundo, principalmente responsable de su cartera de patentes, licencias de propiedad intelectual salientes y entrantes, la estrategia de propiedad intelectual, adquisiciones y desinversiones de patentes, conflictos, práctica de indemnizaciones y prelitigios. Previo a Microsoft, Micky se desempeñó como vicepresidente de Estrategia de Propiedad Intelectual en Qualcomm, en San Diego, California, por 13 años. Micky tiene una licenciatura en Ingeniería Eléctrica de la Universidad de Marquette, una maestría en Ingeniería Eléctrica de la Universidad George Washington y un JD y LLM de la Universidad de New Hampshire, donde es el director del Centro de Propiedad Intelectual y distinguido profesor de la práctica de propiedad intelectual de Franklin Pierce. Minhas es miembro del Board of Trustees de la Universidad de Marquette, en la que ha estado desde 2019.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I hope I'm presenting. Can I get confirmation from someone that it's being shown? Okay, looks like it's being shown. So yes, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And so my honor and pleasure to be speaking here and to be speaking with all of you. As the introduction mentioned, I'm a senior vice president of the Marconi Group, where I work on a lot of intellectual property licensing, but I'm also director of the Franklin Pierce Center for Intellectual Property at the Franklin Pierce UNH Law School. And I've been in that role for a couple of years. And it's under that I really would like to talk about this topic about social platforms and freedom of speech. Being from the United States, this will have a bit of a U.S. slant to it in terms of its approach, but I suspect that it will be very similar in terms of analysis in other countries and how to think about it. So to start with, we live in a very different world than we lived 10 years ago, in terms of the acceptance and the frequency and the impact of all of the different social networks that we're on. Probably started more with Facebook and perhaps LinkedIn as being sort of one's personal life and one's professional life, and sharing pictures of families and friends has rapidly turned into people's primary news sources, or perhaps the first place people go to when there's an event around the world and people want to live stream what that event is. And of course, that's increased over time through the other social networks, Twitter and TikTok and Snapchat and so on. And it's really grown to be quite pervasive. How pervasive, you may ask? Well, this is what the numbers look like today. We are approximately 4 billion people use social media worldwide. And to give you a sense of 4 billion is a little bit more than half of the world's population. There's 7.82 billion people in the world today. So half of the people in the world are on social media. However, not all the people in the world are on the internet. And if you look at the internet number of active users, it's 4.57 billion. And so if you look at the 3.96 billion or the 4 billion people that use social media, out of the 4.57 billion internet users, 83% of the world, which is the internet users that make the most difference, is on a social network. So it is a large forum. So 99% of the people access the websites or apps through a mobile device, and that those numbers are becoming more pervasive and more important. Um, so social media is pretty much being used by everyone. If the numbers are around, as I mentioned, 83% are active users. That's a significant portion. So you may ask, what about the other 17%? What's going on there? And if you look at the age breakdown on the right side, you can see basically that it is much higher percentage for those that are younger versus those that are older. So 18 to 29, the age group, 88% of people are on social media. And you can see that the 65 years and older, is the least at 37%. So what does that mean over time? As the population shifts, as those 29-year-olds become 30 and the 49-year-olds become 50 and the 64-year-olds become 65, we'll see all of those numbers shift to where it'll be higher and higher and higher, since the predominant group that is not on the internet are really our oldest population. So, in another 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, those numbers will go way up and we'll be at 80, 90% plus of the world's population on social media. So it is by far the largest forum for people to really have any sort of conversation. And I think it's helpful to think about what sorts of conversations are we having. And here you can see on the right side a list of the top 21 social media sites on the internet today, and as well the company name and the country and when it was launched. But the right side column, I think, is the most interesting, the monthly active users. And let's just take Facebook for a moment. 2.8 billion monthly active users. So that is close to 1/3 of the world's population. More than half of all internet users are active on Facebook. And you can see Facebook isn't represented once, it's actually represented several times. 1, 3, 4, and 6 are all Facebook companies when you add WhatsApp, Messenger, and Instagram. So it has a huge impact on the level of people on social media around the world. So in the United States, we really think about this issue, and you might hear it a lot, is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment in the United States is really about the freedom of speech, and the fact that people can really say anything that they want, as long as within certain limits in terms of inciting a crowd or something like that. But social networks are private. All of the companies that I have listed here, none of them are government agencies. These are all private companies held in private hands and running a private business. And the First Amendment, however, that regulates public behavior or government behavior. The First Amendment addresses what the government can and can't do in terms of suppressing speech. So at least in the United States, there is no First Amendment rights in social media platforms. It's really up to these different companies to address what type of content can be on or should not be on, or any limits that can be associated with it. Public speeches, and here you can see a big march on the US Capitol. Public speeches are regulated. If you want to have a rally around the US Capitol, you have to have a permit. That permit will allow you to have it for a specified time. There will have to be safety precautions and police and security that is hired. And if the marches are on the sidewalk, then you don't necessarily need a permit. But if it's on the street or occupying a public space, as in this picture, those have to be approved. But the one thing that cannot be regulated is the content of the speech itself, just really the types of forum and the protections around the forum, but not the subject matter. The content can be whatever whatever the person applying for the permit wants it to be. And as speech gets more controversial, you'll have very different opinions on it. For example, hate speech. Is hate speech free speech? Is it really important to distinguish on the type of content? And you can see that hate speech is free speech. If someone wants to have a rally that is against a certain population or demographics or any of those sorts of things, the First Amendment protects that. People can have that type of speech, even if it's hate speech. And where the cyber companies today, the social media companies today, really make this distinction between the First Amendment being public and government action, and all of the companies being sort of private, that private actions and private companies, where private companies can do what they want. That is where the law currently draws the line and distinguishes between those two things. In the United States, an American football player named Colin Kaepernick would take a knee, was kneeling during the national anthem. And this was highly controversial as to whether or not an NFL player kneeling and in protest, is that a public speech, or it is a public expression of views, or is it one that is private? And basically, the National Football League is a private league. It is a private football league. It is a business owned by the National Football League and by its owners, and they can choose to regulate what the players do and how they do it. So whether the NFL would allow players to kneel or not have them kneel is up to the NFL to decide. The government does not have a role associated with that. Living in the United States, it's hard to imagine something that's more public than an NFL game. The games are widely broadcast. It's probably the most popular sport in the United States, and millions and millions of people are watching it. Yet it is viewed as a private business and not necessarily public. And I think we really have to start questioning ourselves, well, what is the difference between private and public, and why do we have these rules associated with the public, and why is it that they don't apply in something that's private? So I think it's helpful to perhaps take one step back and think about, what are the justifications for the First Amendment? Why do we have it? And really, there's sort of two underlying theories or two underlying policies associated with First Amendment protections. The first is that by having speech protected and not trying to regulate the content of the speech, it becomes a marketplace of ideas. People can decide what they want to speak on, what they would choose to adhere to, and what they would choose to reject, what they would choose to accept. And the government should not distort that market and engage in any type of controlling of that content. Let the people decide what they accept and what they reject. The marketplace decides. So that is one of the fundamental underlying justifications for the First Amendment. The second is about individual self-fulfillment. And the idea here is that as humans, we need and we crave the ability to express ourselves. And we don't want to stunt people's growth in terms of what they would want to do. That as humans, we need to have this level of self-fulfillment and allowing people to behave in which they want to behave, and allow the marketplace to decide what is accepted and what is rejected. Censorship of any sort has the ability of stunting that growth and sort of forming the opinions for them. And if for countries that are not democracies, and you're all familiar with at least some of them, you know what that means, right? If the government starts controlling the content of what is being seen, then it is a way of controlling their population. And democracies, that's something that is just a fundamental difference in belief and difference in how to approach it and some fundamental underlying beliefs of it. So now we are left with this, excuse me, First Amendment protects the public. It regulates what governments can and can't do in terms of that speech. But we have social media platforms very pervasive, so pervasive where 83% of the entire world, of the internet world, I should say, is on some level of social media. There was a case about 3 or 4 years ago called Packingham versus North Carolina, and there were some interesting statements that were made in that, and a recognition that people communicate on social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter more than they do in offline venues. You're not seeing as many, people standing in the town square and having a speech as much as you are now. There's sort of the virtual version of that. People are doing that on Facebook and Twitter as opposed to doing it necessarily in person, or perhaps both. You're seeing it in both places. And I think one of the things that came out of the court was this statement that while in the past there may have been difficulty in identifying the most important places for the exchange of views, today the answer is clear. It's cyberspace, the vast democratic forums of the internet in general, and social media in particular. And again, this case was from 4 years ago. This is before the pandemic, before the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and what an important role, and frankly, before President Trump and his use of Twitter had really taken place. So if there was any doubt in terms of the importance of social media sites, a lot of, I think, the most important events that we naturally think about really happened just in the last couple of years, let alone 4 years ago. And it was Justice Kennedy who made that statement that the expansion of social media has contributed to a revolution of historic proportion. And social media networking sites today, they are the modern day equivalent of the public forum. It's no longer the public park or the public street where this protest is made, where words are expressed, where the marketplace of ideas are shared, but rather it is the various social media platforms about it. So now we're in this odd place where private businesses, and we'll use Facebook as an example, private businesses are the ones who are tasked with administering these public forum of sharing of marketplace of ideas and allowing people a freedom of expression and so on. And yet we have in the law this distinction between public and private. So one of the steps that Facebook has taken is to create the Facebook Oversight Board. Excuse me. And so the idea behind the Facebook Oversight Board is to create a board that Facebook has to answer to, that create something that would be quasi-independent and allowing for the free expression and independent judgment as to what should and what should not be allowed. And when the board was established, and you can see some of the quotes here, as the community grew to more than 2 billion people, the Facebook company shouldn't be the only ones making the decision about speech and online safety on its own. So the Oversight Board was created to help Facebook answer some of the difficult questions around freedom of expression, what to take down, what to leave up, the reasons for doing so. And so they spent a lot of time and effort in recruiting this board. And the idea is that the board would use its independent judgment to support the people's rights for freedom of expression and ensure that those rights are respected. And the board's decision to uphold or reverse Facebook's content decisions are binding, meaning Facebook has to implement them. So Facebook, a private company, is hiring an independent board that it pays for to basically render judgment on decisions that Facebook would then would then adhere to. So in some ways, Facebook is trying to create a group of people that's neither government, certainly not the government. They are still private in the sense that it is Facebook that employs and has set this up. But they've tried to set it up in a very independent way, in a non-governmental way, in which to advise and create policies and suggest what Facebook should do. So the oversight board has its own set of rules and guidelines, and you can see the current members in the board in the background. They've been recruited from all over the world, and there are various academics and former government officials and so on. But it's a pretty straightforward process where if a piece of content is controversial, it goes to the board and an appeal is submitted to the board. The board determines which cases will be heard amongst it. And this looks and feels very much like the Supreme Court in a lot of ways. The panel, the board assigns a subset of these members to hear the case, and then once the case is heard, a decision is eventually made. The panel comes to decision, and they make that final decision and the policy recommendations, and then that is the final decision. And Facebook can then publicly respond to what the board's decision is and go ahead and implement that decision. So that is how the process is supposed to work. And why don't we walk through one of the more significant cases that the Oversight Board has recently considered. And this was Facebook's ban on Donald Trump's speech, which was done on May 5th of 2000. Facebook at that time has banned Donald Trump from its platform and entirely due to its comments during the insurrection of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. And excuse me. So what the Oversight Board stated that Facebook was justified in its decision at the time to suspend Donald Trump from its platform after that insurrection, and that they do not have to reinstate Trump's access to Facebook and Instagram immediately. Now, the Oversight Board went on to say that Facebook was wrong to impose an indefinite ban and said, Facebook, you have 6 months to decide, either restore Trump's account and therefore making his or make his suspension permanent, or specify him for a specific period of time. So basically, the Supreme Court, more or less, or the Oversight Board, the Facebook Supreme Court, sort of put it back into Facebook's decisions and said, hey, you have to actually make the decision here. And the Oversight Board went on to say that Facebook, you're attempting to avoid your own responsibilities by imposing an indefinite suspension and applying a vague and standardless penalty on Donald. The board insisted that Facebook has to apply and justify a defined penalty, that you need to make a rule, either ban him permanently or let him back on or suspend him for some period of time. But you just can't kick it over to the board and say you deal with it and sort of avoid the issue. And as you can see, one of the members of the board, Michael McConnell, said, "We're not here for Facebook just to lob politically controversial hot potatoes at us for us to decide." So basically, the board pushed it back onto Facebook and said, "You have to do something about this." So I think it's really interesting in that sense that here Facebook is making this oversight board. The board has said, yes, Facebook, you are at least initially accurate in terms of suspending him for the comments made on January 6th. But at the same time, you can't just indefinitely not make a decision, not have any rules. This is very, very arbitrary in terms of how it's being implemented. So I think there's a real question on here: is Facebook really trying? Is this something that they actually want to solve? Or is it, as Professor McConnell stated, is it really just moving the hot potato over and sort of deflecting the real issue and deflecting Facebook's responsibility and sort of giving it to this oversight board as a way of simply not dealing with it? I think there's a real question as to what are Facebook's motivations and what is it that they want to see or want to have as an outcome of this, or is it just absolving themselves as the responsibility? In order to think that through, I think it's important to look at Facebook's business model, right? What is it, and what does it do? And frankly, the business models for all of the social media companies. Social media's business models are essentially advertising-based business models. Content is put up by the users, or content is put up by other companies that is paid for, and then it's advertising-based. However, newspapers have been doing this for years, right? Half of the newspaper is ads, the other half is content. But newspapers have responsibilities. Newspapers have to decide which articles to publish and why. They have to make sure that the articles are truthful and that there is liability associated when newspapers publish false information. They actually have to go through steps to make sure it's accurate. So social media, of course, has a very different business model in that sense. Excuse me. All this talking is making my throat cough. How do you do that? How do you do that level of editorial control when you have 500 million tweets a day, when there are 4 billion videos being shown on Facebook? It is not possible to go through the same level of editorial processes that a newspaper would go through based on the sheer volume of activity that occurs on these social media sites. So what has been suggested and what Facebook and others have implemented are basically artificial intelligence models. Can they apply artificial intelligence models to weed out say fake news or content that is insightful or anything that should be taken down? Well, these models are really only about 80% effective today in terms of identifying that content. And even when they're 80% effective, there are false positives and there are false negatives. So that 80% will result in some amount of legitimate comments or videos or tweets that probably should not have been taken down. And also there are lots of other comments and videos and tweets that are getting through and not being caught by those AI models. Even if 80% are caught, well, that's still 100 million tweets that need to be reviewed, right? That's still another billion videos per day that have to be reviewed that are not getting through. So the AI models are not good enough to be able to really address this. Secondly, companies in the United States have protection under what's called 230, and here's Section 230. But basically, what it does is that allows for immunity for social media sites. Social media sites are not like newspapers and are protected by limitations of liabilities as afforded in Section 230. And really, it's because of an argument that, if you think about the underlying view on it, is that the social media companies will argue that they are a platform, and therefore they should not be regulated like newspapers, but rather they're just a platform for anyone to express anything, and they don't have any sort of control or liabilities associated with what's on its platform. In some ways, it's comparable to a platform of like a telephone line, right? So the in the United States, the telephone companies, if it's AT&T or Verizon or whomever, they're just a platform for people to communicate from one person to the other person. They don't care about what's being said, whether what's being said is legitimate or what's being said is planning of a crime. Nobody really goes to the telephone company and says they're responsible if a crime is being planned using their service. And so the social media companies would like to align themselves with that viewpoint that they are a platform. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, the how social media sites have developed over time has really grown. It's not just sharing pictures with your friends of the birthday party from last weekend. It is a number of people. It is their primary news source. And if you look at what's been displaced, what has happened to the newspaper industry over the last 10 or 20 years, it has all but disappeared. Very few physical copies of newspapers anymore. It's too slow. It's not as accessible. Nobody waits to hear about what happened yesterday and by reading the newspaper. So I think it's very difficult for social media sites to argue that they are more of a platform when the companies that they have displaced really are the news sites, right? So in any evolving of an industry, I think it's important to look at which companies or players survived and which companies or players have become casualties. And certainly the news sources have all become casualties as technology has evolved. But the platforms really haven't. Like, we still use our phones as much as ever, if not more so. Our dependence on wireless carriers is greater today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So it's not the telephone companies that are being displaced. It's really the news companies that are being displaced instead. And so I think it's, my personal opinion, it's the social media companies are really just trying to rely on this Section 230 liability to deal with a fundamental problem that's truly a problem of its business model. Its business model of the sheer volume of use of it does not align itself well with how a comparable industry such as newspapers had dealt with it. And so the real question I think we have to ask ourselves is the benefits of having social media outweigh the responsibilities of that social media? There will always be a degree of material on social media that should not be posted that was posted, right? The artificial intelligence models will never be good enough to be able to catch everything to that level. And there will also, again, be these situations of false positives and false negatives. False negatives means expression can be suppressed. If I want to tweet something that, let's just say, is not controversial, but the filters that Twitter is using does think it's controversial, well, then it's monitoring the content of my speech. And we don't want that to occur either, because now it's suppressing and acting more like a government. And on the other hand, we don't want those sorts of types of speech that should not be on social media. We don't want that to persist either. So it really is quite a dilemma, and I think we have to decide what is the role are we going to impose higher standards in social media? And I think, at least in the United States, there's a big movement towards amending Section 230. And this is one side that, whether you're conservative or liberal, I think both sides sort of agree that the level of responsibility that social media companies has to increase, and that Section 230 and its liability limitations really are too great relative to what they should be. And so I think, at least in the US, we're likely to see reform to Section 230 to cause these social media companies, to spend more time and resources in terms of controlling its client, its content and its information. And we'll probably see more oversight boards. So Facebook, for as much as the oversight board is critical of Facebook, at least they have created an oversight board. That's more than what can be said for Twitter and Snapchat and TikTok and all of the rest. So I believe those companies are most likely going to consider putting together some sort of oversight board as well, in the absence of any government action, because it's the only thing they really can do to help regulate. Remember, the business models here are all about advertising. And so whether or not certain posts are up or not really doesn't impact their business in terms of that advertising. They'll continue to see it. Many people thought the importance of Twitter would go down after President Trump lost his reelection bid. And that didn't happen. Twitter is as popular as under Trump as it is after Trump. And so some of those views of like, you need controversial people on the platform in order to attract it, is not proving itself to be true. So in my opinion, the time has really come to recognize that the First Amendment has to be expanded. It's not the private public distinction does not work as well when you think about social media companies and the broad reach that they actually have. And despite business models, social media companies have responsibilities, and I think should be held accountable. Having a business model that's not conducive to your responsibilities, I don't think should be, sort of serve as an excuse or a reason not to do it, but rather it's the reason to do it. And so again, these are my personal beliefs, not that of Marconi or of the law school. But I really think that these two things need to happen. We have to not draw this, I would call what is now an artificial distinction between private and public. And then secondly, social media companies, they need to evolve their business models, and perhaps it's a little bit different in terms of the types of content and the process that one needs to go through. We've all seen the impact of fake news and deep fakes and language, or I should say posts that are insightful and have caused riots and so on. And so social media companies, I think, definitely have a responsibility in this space and should be addressed as such. So that's what I have for my prepared remarks. I wanted it to be about 40 minutes, and we have about 20 minutes remaining, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know Ricardo is online and perhaps taking questions along, and so I will stop sharing my screen, and let's have some question and answer.
Hey, Mickey, thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Insightful, very clear. Makes me very happy to be an alumni of, FPLC/UNH, because it was very clear, very centered, and I think you did not avoid, the hot potato issues, which, I appreciate. And, at some level, you and I have not discussed this issue, but I think I'm very aligned with what you said. There has been, I think, not only in social platforms, but the world is moving, to a decentralized system, right? Not only news, we see that, with finance, with fintech, with the cryptocurrencies, et cetera, et cetera. And I see that the government is struggling to keep pace. And, one example, of course, is who's going to regulate cryptos, right?
Right.
So I see some of the same struggles. I see some parallelisms with the discussions that you were having today with social media. I mean, as you said, it has evolved from, hey, let's share some pictures to, or, let's connect, with other friends, to pretty much the way you are, getting your news today. That's what's going on. I mean, I'm a junkie for news, and right now, if I go to newspapers, even if the newspaper, is once a day, is not updated. I think you go there if you want a deeper opinion, but if you want, developments as they occur, you gotta go to social media. So I think, the model has changed, and of course, the regulations are not kept pace. But one question, that I have for you is, I do think, that by shielding, social platforms, the government is kind of like delegating the First Amendment function. So I think that was a question to you, because, many people, when of course, the issue with President Trump arose, pretty much, they wanted to simplify saying, First Amendment doesn't apply, to private companies. But I don't think that's the case. I think, that First Amendment eventually, the government, has delegated a function, can also apply, to private companies. So I'm not sure if you have any views on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting thought. I mean, these laws were written, Section 230 was written into the AIA a number of years ago, and social media was not nearly as controversial in terms of the content that was on it when those laws were first passed as to where it is today. So social media networks have definitely evolved into, perhaps reconnecting with old friends and that you haven't seen in a long period of time, into, as you say, people's primary news sources. One analogy that I know others have written about is how in the United States, how people have dealt, how the government has sort of dealt with discrimination over time. So let's, take it back to the 1860s or 1920s or 1950s in the United States, and the discrimination, such as, say, for example, African Americans, can't shop in a store, are not allowed in, or something like that, right? And some of those early cases in that time frame drew the same public-private distinction, and the courts were saying, well, it's a private business. A private business can do whatever they want to do, and if they choose to discriminate, they can choose to discriminate. That's how the cases were in the late 1800s. Eventually, though, the government sort of stepped in and had to create something that even regulated private businesses and said, yes, I know your business is private, but there are some fundamental things here that are just wrong. And we're not going to allow that level of discrimination even in your private business. So the government, and it took 50 plus years in order for the law to evolve over that period of time. But the arguments that were made initially were all along this exact same public versus private type of line. Hey, we're the government. We have no role in a private business. A private business can do whatever they want to do. That was what the government was saying 100 years ago, and that's what they're saying today with respect to social media. Yeah,
and it sounds a little bit like, with COVID, the guidelines. Well, these are the guidelines, but at the end of the day, it's up to you, the CDC guidelines, right? We have the guidelines, but at the end of the day, you can decide whatever you want, right?
Exactly.
And then you did mention the NFL. So I was curious about, would you apply a different standard between what happened in the NFL versus a social platform? Because a social platform, of course, is such a public forum.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because it is it was the NFL's own decision to allow for kneeling in the national anthem. The government didn't play a role in this, but it was just sort of, I would say, it's sort of pressure that the NFL as a league felt from its players and from its
sponsors,
fan base and sponsors and so on, right? So in much the same way, you're seeing private industry sort of step in and take these steps, and so you're seeing this happen time and time again, where our companies have gotten so big and so powerful that they will step in and take action where the government does not take action.
Right.
When President Trump left the Paris Accord for climate change, cities and states and private businesses adopted the climate change anyway, right? They sort of did it anyway. Or if there was masks were not mandated in a certain place or in a certain state or a certain city, Walmart and Target made their own rules and said, well, you have to anyway, right? And so you're seeing businesses, sort of very large businesses, sort of step up and make their own rules that are like in the face of what the government is doing in one way or the other. I think that goes, again, this private-public distinction is really, as our companies have gotten so big and so powerful, is the private-public distinction starts to make less and less sense.
Correct. I mean, look at Amazon, for example. Yeah. Amazon can substitute so many times, so it's much more powerful than the government. That I agree that at some point, that line becomes very blurred. And you did mention, and I also agree that possibly we'll see an amended Section 230, because I think that both sides, are in agreement with, different reasonings, but I think both agree that the section has to be amended. Any ideas how, an amended Section 230 could look like?
Yeah, so that is a very controversial issue, because as we just talked about, these companies are very large and very powerful today. And there are a lot of companies that are those large and powerful companies that have very vested interests in making sure that the law remains the same. So the social media companies, Google, so on, they really use Section 230 well. There were many of the same companies that lobbied to get the protection in place in the very first place. But I bring it back to the business model. The basic business model for many of these companies is, using your personal data, selling it for targeted advertising. That is the basic business model. And that's the Google business model, that's the Facebook business model, that's the rest of the social media companies' business models. And so I think that's really the issue here, is this clash of it. And it's really been a turning point, I would say, in the last 10 years ago or so, where there's a perception of free products, right? Social media doesn't cost us anything. As a user, Facebook is free, right? As a user, Google search engines are free. Android software is free. All of these things come across as being free. But obviously they're not free. The business models are indirect. The business models are about using that information in your profit. You did not see it as pervasive even just 20 years ago. And a lot of the laws are built on the fact that you build a product, you sell a product, you buy the newspaper, right? You have to pay for it. It wasn't free, and so on. Like these, and so the business models as a whole have sort of changed from paying for a good or service to an expectation that the good or service is free, and that the monetization is occurring, indirectly.
Micky, let me read you quickly a question I got from my colleague, Marco Palacios. So he said, you pointed out several aspects of the equation that need to be placed into balance. I agree with your thoughts. Social platforms need to have a level of liability as they run a business that substantially impacts society. Experience shows that social media platforms present an unprecedented challenge for regulators. As of now, society is leaving decisions, rather leaving inaction on private companies. Private companies as well may be influenced by ideologies or business motivations. Internet and social media does not only bring freedom and equality, it too brings constitutional and social values under pressure. Some online media companies have acknowledged that even extremists and terrorist groups use social media to spread their message. Social media platforms are a business model. We should not evaluate them by comparing them to other means.
Yeah. And this is where it gets to be difficult, right? Sorry if I can interject for a moment. So I had one slide where I talked a bit about hate speech, right? And so this is where it really gets to be difficult, because it's sort of a moral issue, right? Like, nobody really wants to see hate speech out onto these platforms, but the First Amendment allows for protection of hate speech. It allows for protection of, this marketplace of ideas. In a physical world, if someone goes to the town square and has very negative, call it close to hate speech types of comments, that's allowed, right? The problem on the internet is that the scope of the reach is so broad, and one can gather and really being able to gather and form a larger group than they would otherwise around these controversial topics. And I do think, as we look around the world today, we are a much more divided world than we were 10 or 20 years ago.
Issues, absolutely.
Exactly. And in every country, right? This isn't a Western phenomenon or an Eastern phenomenon or a US phenomenon or not. The world is becoming more divided, partially, I think, because these ideas, whether they're mainstream or whether they're highly controversial, are getting much, much broader audiences.
Yeah, right, correct. Correct. Yeah, because the ideas are, getting disseminated. Before, you have, for example, fringe groups. I don't want to get into politics, but QAnon, suddenly, they have a huge platform, to spread their message. So, it's more difficult to deal with it, right?
Right. Spreading the message, and then also not being able to distinguish between what is real and what is fake. And there's no responsibility associated with that platform. If those same things were being done on a newspaper, the newspaper simply wouldn't publish it as being outright false. Or if they did publish it, there would be liability associated with it. On the online equivalent, it's not happening. And so, at that level, it becomes rather obvious, right? In terms of how to deal with it. But the social media companies struggle with the sheer volume. How do you handle 500 million tweets a day and however many posts there are on Facebook on a daily basis? It just does not, that level of regulation doesn't work with their business model. And so they just simply continue to do so.
And I have here an interesting question. My apologies, because, as you and I talk, I'm reading the phone where I'm getting questions. And, at the heart, we are an IP association. So this has been great because, we did, speak about, the First Amendment, which of course sometimes is, very relevant for what we do. But with respect to IP, let's talk about trademarks. Do you see that at some point, should there be a different standard between, the balance if, let's say, the speech is political or the speech is commercial, when you have trademarks involved, as to the enforcement of a trademark owner? Is there a different test there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I have a solid answer for you as to whether it's a good test or not. But the problem, I think, is that it's so ephemeral. Things are just on for a moment, and how do you enforce that trademark? As you know, the length of time involved in any sort of legal action, and being able to find the defendant and being able to address it, particularly if it's a fringe group, they'll simply move to another site, move to a different name, and this game of cat and mouse. I mean, it's, for those of you who have been involved in counterfeit goods over the years, right? It's kind of the same thing, right? You can try to catch them, but they simply show up under a different form in a different way. The internet sort of exasperates that problem, and I think we sort of continue to have that. On the copyright side, I think the problem is even more pervasive, right? How do you chase this? How do you chase all the potential types of copyright infringement, misappropriation that is occurring on such a level? Extremely difficult to do without, when the platforms themselves are not absolving themselves, when they absolve themselves of any liability.
And then I have here a quick question for you. In the Trump case, that dealt, of course, with an individual. So the question is, should the decision be taken by a court instead of by Twitter? for example?
Yeah, so exactly. So, I mean, I think the courts are sort of hiding between this public-private distinction right now. But I think if a case were to come up, as Justice Kennedy stated in the Packingham, North Carolina case, there's a recognition that the town square is now Facebook, right? And so I think the courts are probably ready to make that level of regulation. And the social media sites, they're sort of now invested with deciding what these rules ought to be. But there's kind of this, it's hard not to recognize there's this level of political correctness, a layer of political correctness that goes over the social media sites. But the First Amendment is way lower, right? The First Amendment is allowing absolutely everything. And so, there will be a lot of people that will be very unhappy if social media sites sort of lower their bar to the First Amendment and allow all types of speech, whether they agree with it or not.
Right, and I think that it would be great to have a self-regulated industry. I'm personally very big, self-regulation, but I don't think that the industry is there yet. So I think that's the intersection where we are. You don't have enough, self-regulation, but then you say you gotta shield me in the meantime. Great,
Exactly.
you, but have the Facebook board. It's great. That's great that they have a board, but that's not the standard in the industry. So
it's not. And I had a conversation with one of the executives of a different social media company. We were talking about the Facebook board, and basically what he said was, look, it's perfect political cover for them. They get to push everything to the board. Meanwhile, what Facebook really cares about is the ability to continue to advertise and monetize the advertising, and none of that is addressed by the board. And so, they can sort of push these issues over to the board that are controversial, absolve themselves of that liability. But what they really care about is that the advertising continues.
Keeps coming in, right?
Exactly.
Micky, I mean, I don't want to take more time from you. I know that you're very busy. I mean, honestly, the feedback that I'm getting, it's people loved, the presentation. I mean, it's such a great issue, and I hope that soon we can have you, again. Hopefully soon, we can have it in person. That's what
would be great.
Aim. I love Zooms, Teams, etc. But I think enough is enough.
Yeah, well, I really thank you for hosting and having me. I really enjoyed it. It's a topic with no real good answers at the end of the day.
But you had great answers, and you had you frame it greatly. So thank you, Micky. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody that joined, and we'll continue in the afternoon. So I just to invite everybody to connect also in the afternoon for the rest of the program. Micky, thank you so much again. All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Bye.